They pretty much put her through hell.
Gang raped.
22-year-old Jodelle survived hell.
I get kidnapped, sex trafficked out.
But hell has a habit
The flashbacks.
of hanging on.
I get flashbacks.
Take me somewhere. If they see me, they're gonna kill me.
This flashback is 6 years ago, the moment St. Paul police rescued Jodelle.
I want my mom.
16 years old and developmentally delayed, Jodelle ran away from her Duluth Superior area home with an 18-year-old friend to meet some boys the friend knew down in the cities. Those boys, Fonity Diggs and Timothy Cross, turned out not to be friends. The girls were taken to this St. Paul motel. Room 229 is where Jodelle's hell began.
I had a knife put up to my neck when I was being raped.
That night, she says Diggs and Cross sold her,
They hurt me really bad inside.
turn by turn, to their friends.
They told me that they owned me and that I had to go to work.
Go to work. That meant the next morning, ordered to walk this strip of St. Paul Street, offering her body for sale. Jodelle had other plans, despite the pimp's threats to shoot her if she did not obey them. She called her mom, Judy.
Crying and screaming, hysterical. Mom, they took me and they want me to be a prostitute.
Judy told her to immediately call police, and St. Paul officers rushed to her rescue.
I'm so scared. They're gonna come after my family now.
Diggs and Cross were eventually captured. Their conviction as sex traffickers headline news. Jodelle returned home.
My life changed.
She'd escaped hell, but not the demons.
The nightmares, I relived and what they did to me.
To help young sex trafficking victims like Jodelle get the trauma support services they need, Minnesota passed a law in 2011 that mandates all traffickers and buyers, so-called pimps and johns, pay a special fine. It's called a prostitution assessment and ranges between $500 to $1,000. It gets split 3 ways. 40% to police for enforcement and training to combat sexual exploitation. 20% to the prosecutor for education and training to combat sexual exploitation. The remaining 40% to service organizations that provide care for sexually exploited youth. The law is really clear. It says the court may not waive payment of the assessment.
The legislature is pretty clear. There shall be a fine, and it may not be waived.
State Senator Michelle Benson says if a judge does not impose the assessment, they're violating the clear intent of the legislature. But Carol Levin discovered convicted pimps Fonity Diggs and Timothy Cross never had to pay that assessment. Why? Because court records show Judge Leslie Merrick never ordered it. We emailed Judge Merrick asking why the failure to fine. She refused to be interviewed, responding, "I do not comment on my cases nor on my decision-making process." So Carol Levin decided to find out if the case of the men who sold Jodelle for sex was an isolated oversight or part of a pattern of judges cutting sex traffickers a break at the expense of care for survivors. When we analyzed 7 years of statewide court data, we found from 2011 to 2017, there were 196 traffickers sentenced, but 118 of them, 60%, had no prostitution assessment imposed.
Wow.
What's even more troubling, Carol Levin discovered that criminals who exploit underage girls like Jodelle are more likely to get the assessment fine waived than those who trafficked adult women.
I cannot fathom how somebody could look at a crime against a child and take it less seriously than they take crimes against adults.
And I think it's an awareness issue or unawareness issue.
Robert Small is a retired judge and the executive director of the Minnesota County Attorneys Association.
We're talking about judges and prosecutors. How can ignorance of the law be acceptable?
Well, that's a fair question. And hopefully we'll do a better job.
Judge Small says after hearing from KARE 11, he put this reminder for prosecutors in his association's monthly newsletter to ask judges for the fine. An important reminder, given this is money that is supposed to be used to help trafficking survivors like Jodelle rise above their living hell.
I haven't forgotten. It's still in my head.
We wanted to know if it's just the sex traffickers or are the buyers, the so-called Johns who fuel Minnesota's sex trade, also getting away with not paying this mandatory fine, and also just how much money meant to help victims is being lost. Our investigation continues tomorrow night at 10.
How is it that they could be unaware? I find that hard to believe, that judges could be unaware.
That was the question we were asking. Is ignorance of the law an excuse if you're a judge? And not a single member of Minnesota's judicial branch will explain this, will do an interview, will respond to questions. What needs to happen?
Like I said, I think we need to have hearings. We need to call them in and we need to ask questions about why they're not following the law.
A state lawmaker is calling for legislative hearings tonight after a KARE 11 investigation.
Our team exposed Minnesota judges shortchanging sex trafficking victims by failing to hold pimps and Johns fully accountable. Here's AJ Legault with the latest development in his investigation, Sex Trafficking, a Failure to Fine.
It's outrageous. It's shocking and outrageous. If we can't count on judges to follow the law, who can we count on?
State Representative Kathy Lomer responding to KARE 11's investigation that revealed Minnesota judges frequently waive a mandatory fine on convicted sex traffickers, despite the law clearly stating that it cannot be waived.
If they're not following the law, if they're waiving fines when the law specifically says you cannot waive the fines, then they have some explaining to do.
Here's examples of what needs to be explained. Washington County Senior Judge Susan Miles failed to fine sex trafficker Ricky Turner, who frequently bragged on social media about his lavish lifestyle and all the cash he was making off the women he sold for sex.
Yeah, this all last night, trap man.
And Ramsey County Judge Leslie Merrick failed to fine the men who trafficked this young woman, who was just 16 years old at the time.
I had a knife put up to my neck when I was being raped.
This is money that is supposed to be used by police and prosecutors to combat sexual exploitation and
I want my mom.
to provide care and services for survivors.
We want to help the victims of sex trafficking. That's a pretty big issue right now. And if we have judges that aren't following the law, I don't even know what to say. It's very upsetting.
The KARE 11's investigation found statewide judges have waived the fines for 60% of sex traffickers. Tonight at 10, our investigation continues as we question if the buyers, the so-called Johns who fuel the sex trade here in Minnesota, are also getting away with not paying this mandatory fine. Also, we look into just how much money meant to help victims is being lost.
911, where's your emergency?
I need help.
What kind of help do you need?
There's 3 people trying to prostitute me.
Bought and sold by gun-packing pimps. A teenage girl calls 911 begging to be rescued.
They're going to kill me because I'm theirs and no one else is.
According to the Minnesota Attorney General, Minneapolis is one of the top locations in the U.S. for child sex trafficking.
Put your hands on your head. Put your hands on your head.
For years, KARE 11 Investigates has documented the busts of those who buy women and children for sex.
My wife's going to be really mad at me.
The takedowns of traffickers.
Get your hands up.
And the rescue of victims like this one, the girl from the 911 call you're about to meet.
Take me somewhere. If they see me, they're going to kill me.
Rescue is not the same as recovery.
My life changed.
As 22-year-old Jodelle can attest.
Made me go on drugs and become a junkie.
Jodelle, with the support of her mother by her side, decided to share her story with the belief it could help protect other young women. Inside this Twin Cities motel, the developmentally delayed girl, just 16 at the time, was raped, held, and sold for sex.
So I turned to the only thing that made it go out of my mind was the drugs.
Have you been able to get past the drugs?
No.
does take a lot of healing to get through it.
Beth Holger is executive director of The Link, which provides care such as housing, education, and counseling for young sex trafficking survivors who do get out.
We just don't have enough funding and resources to serve everybody that needs help.
To help fund efforts like The Link's, Minnesota lawmakers created a special fine known as a prostitution assessment that all convicted sex traffickers and buyers, pimps and johns, must pay. State Senator Michelle Benson says there is zero wiggle room.
The legislature, in the case of trafficking, has been very clear. There will be a fine.
The law specifically states the court may not waive payment, but Minnesota judges apparently did not get that memo. In our first report, Carol Evans' investigation found 60% of sex traffickers got no fine, not even the men who trafficked Jodell.
They told me that they owned me and that I couldn't talk to any of my family until I paid my debt off.
But the law does not just target pimps, so we also wanted to know about the buyers, the men who fuel Minnesota's sex trade. Are they too getting a financial free pass?
We saw real inconsistencies.
Nick Chickowitz is executive director of Watch Minnesota, a judicial advocacy organization that sends out volunteers like Joel Mathis, a poli-sci major at the U of M, to monitor what happens in courtrooms.
Today I'm going to be going to see a prostitution buyer case.
Watch spent 3.5 years monitoring sex buyer cases in Hennepin and Ramsey counties. They recently published this report, which found in 65% of the cases where a defendant was convicted of buying sex with an underage girl, the court did not impose a prostitution assessment.
They were inconsistent, well below statutory requirements, or not imposed at all. At all? At all.
Example, Hennepin's Assistant Chief Judge, Todrick Barnett. We checked court records between 2011 and 2017 and found he waived the mandatory fine in every sex buyer and trafficker case he tried. We asked for an interview so he could explain why. He wouldn't do it. But this is not just a problem in Minneapolis and St. Paul. Carol Evan analyzed court data statewide. We discovered in Scott County, 90% of sex buyers got the fine waived. In Dakota County, judges failed to impose it 79% of the time. In Anoka, 50%. Statewide, judges gave 1/3 of all johns a free pass. And this is what's most inexplicable of all. Judges are giving those who buy sex with children an even bigger break. When we crunch the numbers for predators convicted of buying underage kids like Jodell for sex, we discovered the courts failed to impose the so-called mandatory fine more than half the time.
So I am really surprised by what you're telling me. Disappointed, but also surprised.
It's happened at the same time the state has been issuing reports saying there's a lack of funding for programs to help sex trafficking survivors.
And it is frustrating that some of these perpetrators aren't being held accountable and that there are or could be more funds available to help more victims. That's incredibly sad.
So just how much is the state losing by failing to find sex traffickers and buyers? Carol Evans' analysis finds it adds up to at least $250,000. Money that could help survivors like Jodell.
I want my mom.
Still struggling
Because of the hell that I went through.
with life after being trafficked.
Well, we've already heard from a number of prosecutors, including Dakota County Attorney James Backstrom, who says he's now created a formal policy for all of his prosecutors to specifically ask the judges to impose the mandatory fine. Julie, we don't know if the judges will do it because they won't answer any of our questions.
And I did have someone ask me this on social media. Who do they report to? Is there an agency that oversees judges? I know we have elections, but...
We have elections, so voters technically, but other than that, no.
All right, and one last question for you. Surely these judges are not pro-traffickers and pro-johns. Why do you think this is happening? Any guesses?
Guesses would be ignorance of the law. We've heard that they might not be aware of the law. How that's possible, we don't have an answer to because no one will answer our questions.
Tonight, Carol Evan Investigates follows the money. Prosecutors and police across Minnesota are scrambling to find tens of thousands of dollars they're supposed to be using to fight sexual exploitation. But as AJ Legault finds out, that money is either misplaced, misused, or just plain missing.
Okay, that's your car there?
That's my car. That girl was stealing it. We got in a fight.
You're watching police body camera footage from Columbia Heights of what started out as a domestic disturbance call.
Okay, so if he gave you permission to use the car, why would he have called the police?
Because he's mad about something totally different.
But officers quickly determined something much more serious was going on between 54-year-old Bob Moran
I was just trying to help the gal out.
and the 16-year-old girl.
That he's a trick?
That's fine.
Are you a prostitute?
No, I used to be, and he's mad just because I want to have sex with him.
Initially, he denied having sex with the teen, but soon confessed.
I've seen her before, yeah.
Okay, you hired her for sex before?
Right.
The girl later told Anoka sheriff's detectives who took over the investigation that Moran had bought her for sex at least 20 times. He was convicted and sentenced to 45 days in jail and 5 years probation. Minnesota law also requires convicted sex buyers and traffickers to pay a fine called a prostitution assessment. The law says the assessment may not be waived. But Carol Evans' investigation already revealed how Minnesota judges frequently ignore that law and waive the fine at the expense of care for survivors, like the girl in this 911 call.
There's 3 people trying to prostitute me.
Bought and sold by gun-packing pimps, she was rescued from the streets of St. Paul.
Take me somewhere. If they see me, they're gonna kill me.
She bravely shared her story to shine a light on how her traffickers got a financial free pass when the judge failed to follow the prostitution assessment law.
So what happens in those cases where judges actually follow the law and order the prostitution fines? We wanted to know, is that money being used the way the law requires?
I thought she was 18.
That brings us back to Bob Moran. A judge did order him to pay the $1,000 prostitution assessment. That money is supposed to be split 3 ways. 40% to the arresting police agency to combat sexual exploitation. 20% to the prosecutor to combat sexual exploitation. The remaining 40% to organizations that service sexually exploited youth. Since Bob Moran's case was in Anoka County, we asked Sheriff's Department Commander Wayne Heath what happened with their share.
It looks like you guys should have got $400 from that. Did you get it?
No, we didn't.
Turns out Anoka is not alone when it comes to public funds gone missing.
What happened to the money?
That's a great question.
Tim Leslie is Dakota County Sheriff.
Can't find it.
State court records obtained by Carol Evans for the last 4.5 years show exactly how much each law enforcement agency and prosecutor allegedly received from the prostitution fines. They show the Dakota County Sheriff received $300.
I know it says that, but I haven't been able to find it.
Here's other examples. The Duluth Police Department has $1,530 missing. Maple Grove Police claim they never received more than $3,600. At the Steele County Attorney's Office, $1,000 is unaccounted for.
We should know where the money's going.
We shared our findings with State Representative Kathy Lomer, who sponsored legislation related to the prostitution fines.
Is what I've shown you right here acceptable?
No.
Here's how it's supposed to work. The convicted sex trafficker or buyer pays the fine to the court. The court sends the money to the appropriate city or county finance department. The finance department disperses it to law enforcement and the prosecutor. That last step is where the system too often fails.
It got sent to the wrong place?
Correct.
After weeks of searching, Commander Heath says Anoka determined the fine Bob Moran paid all got sent to the county attorney's office, lumped in with other types of fines. None of it was specifically earmarked to combat sex trafficking.
I don't think it was clear, or the people in finance didn't know that the statute dictated how much needed to go to where.
We found similar financial follies all across the state. In Dakota County, money meant to combat sex trafficking went into the community services budget. In Roseville, $5,000 in prostitution fines went into their general fund. In all, statewide, Carol Evans identified at least $34,000 in missing, misplaced, or misused money.
It seems to me there's a lot of explaining that needs to be happening here.
Representative Lomer says legislative hearings need to be held to get to the bottom of this. And while many jurisdictions still cannot tell us what happened to the money, the cities of Rochester and Roseville, along with Anoka, Dakota, Stearns, and Washington counties all tell me they're already making changes to ensure these prostitution fines are properly tracked and used for their very important purpose.
We continue to fail again and again. This is just another demonstration of that.
Public outcry tonight after a Care 11 investigation not only exposed courts shortchanging sex trafficking victims, but discovered the very money meant to help them was being misplaced and misused. Here's AJ Legault with his continuing investigation, a failure to fine.
That's disturbing. That's disappointing.
What Terry Walker McLaughlin, the executive director of the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault, finds so disturbing and disappointing is Care 11's discovery that Minnesota courts routinely waive fines against convicted sex traffickers and buyers that are supposed to be mandatory and used to care for victims who do escape, like the girl in this video from St. Paul.
Take me somewhere. If they see me, they're gonna kill me.
And what's more, even when judges do order the fine, like in the case of this Anoka man convicted of buying a 16-year-old girl for sex.
Okay, you hired her for sex before.
Right.
Care 11 discovered in cities and counties across the state, the money all too often does not go towards its legally required use, combating sexual exploitation, along with providing training and education for prosecutors and law enforcement.
What happened to the money?
That's a great question. We can't find it.
Turns out Dakota County was putting funds in their community services budget.
These funds are not to be misused. They're precious few dollars that go to support victims of sexual violence and trafficking, and the fact that we care for those funds in such a haphazard manner, I think is reflective of the same manner by which we care for victim survivors.
This victim survivor,
My life changed.
shared the painful reality of just what too often happens.
Made me go on drugs and become a junkie.
Have you been able to get past the drugs?
No.
Every area we need to do better. I think that is apparent to all of us now. Now's the time to respond. If it's not going to happen now, it's not going to happen.
Minnesota's judicial branch still hasn't told us what, if anything, they're going to do to ensure judges follow the law and order the mandatory fines. State lawmakers have called for legislative hearings to be held, and you can watch our entire failure to fine investigation on care11.com.
Tonight, a Care 11 investigation discovers a Minnesota city paying its prosecutor what amounts to an unusual bonus for getting convictions.
It is part of our continuing investigation into the misuse of court fines that are supposed to go to combating sexual exploitation. Here's investigative reporter AJ Legault with the latest findings in his series, A Failure to Fine.
October 28th, 2013, inside this Mounds View motel, 19 men were arrested in a prostitution sting, much like this other one that Care 11 cameras were allowed to film. But what happened next when the defendants went to court in Mounds View and how it relates to money allegedly given to this church is now raising serious questions.
There's no reasonable explanation for this.
We asked U of M professor and former chief White House ethics lawyer Richard Painter to review what we uncovered.
That is unheard of in the United States. We do not allow that. It is considered unethical.
To understand what we found Mounds View doing, you have to know Minnesota law requires convicted sex buyers and traffickers to pay a special fine called a prostitution assessment. The law mandates 40% of the fine goes to the police and 20% to the prosecuting agency to be used to combat sexual exploitation. The remaining 40% to service organizations that provide care for sexually exploited youth. Our previous investigation discovered statewide at least $34,000 of this fine cash was missing, misplaced, or misused.
But what is happening here in Mounds View is unique. Our investigation discovered the money that is supposed to be used to combat sexual exploitation was instead paid out in what amounts to a bonus to a private contractor.
Like many cities in Minnesota, Mounds View does not have its own prosecutor's office. Instead, They have contracts with private attorneys like Tom Hughes to serve as city prosecutors. Hughes is paid a monthly retainer to handle cases, but on top of that, records obtained by KARE 11 show when defendants from that prostitution sting at the motel were convicted and hit with the assessment fines, Mounds View cut checks for 20% of the fines, a total of $1,380, to Tom Hughes. Instead of ensuring the money was used to combat sexual exploitation, Mounds View included it as taxed income paid to Hughes.
We do not expect the prosecutors shall be paid a bounty for the cases that they win.
A bounty?
This is indeed a bounty when the prosecutor is paid a percentage of the fine.
What we've uncovered in Mounds View could create motive for prosecutors to obtain wrongful convictions in order to pocket cash, says ACLU of Minnesota Legislative Director Ben Feist.
There's the potential for all sorts of abuse and all sorts of problems.
We wanted to talk with the city leaders, but Mounds View's mayor, Carol Mueller, and city administrator, Niall Zickman, refused to be interviewed, instead sending a lengthy email which states in part, the city distributed a percentage of the assessment to its prosecuting agency, pursuant to the plain wording of the statute, and it was never intended to be a bonus for convictions obtained by the city's prosecuting attorney.
And that's wrong. Is a private attorney with a contract to prosecute an agency?
No. They are a private attorney with a contract. They are in no way a government agency.
State Representative and former prosecutor John Lesh says the prosecuting agency responsible for this public money is the city itself, and Mounds View is dangerously misinterpreting the law.
When someone has a financial incentive to make sure that you're guilty, that casts into doubt the entire constitutional system of rights that we have.
KARE 11 asked Tom Hughes for an interview to discuss what happened to the prostitution fine money that, by law, is supposed to be used to combat sexual exploitation. To date, he's not agreed to meet with us, but wrote in an email he gave the public money from Mounds View to his St. Paul Church, Assumption Parish.
Is this an ethical use of those funds?
No, this is not an ethical use of the funds. It is not to be paid over to the prosecutor as compensation and then used at the prosecutor's discretion for charitable donations.
Hughes is no longer the prosecutor in Mounds View, but Professor Painter thinks he needs to repay this money so it can be used for its legally mandated purpose, combating sex trafficking, and that the state bar needs to open an ethics investigation, guys.
I understand the argument for sure, but do you think this was something that was willfully done wrong or just misinterpreted on the part of the city?
The city says it was a good faith interpretation of the law. Now, the legal experts, we say any attorney should know you can't receive a portion of fines from convictions because that just opens Pandora's box.
Sure. Speaking of Pandora's box, it seems the more you dig on this story, the more you're finding.
Yeah, I mean, we started out when we found that judges across the state are waiving this fine that's supposed to be mandatory and helping victims of sex trafficking. And then we found a bunch of the money is just missing, misplaced, and misused when the judges actually do order it. Now, this.
Well, keep it up.